Well, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. We're very happy today to be looking at this crucial topic of the economic recovery in Africa after COVID-19. My name is Louis Dadouche. I'm a senior fellow
stick together
at Google. And we have, as Farid Zakaria likes to say, a fantastic panel today to discuss this very important question. We will begin with President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who will deliver a keynote speech, and followed by Hafez Ghanem, who is Vice President of the World Bank and clearly one of the most knowledgeable people on the development issues in Africa. Followed, if I remember correctly, by Trudi Makaya, who is economic advisor to the President of South Africa. Then Patricia Obamai, who is CEO of Vodafone in Ghana, will give us a private sector perspective. And last but not least, Koen Doens, who is the head of the Development Aid Directorate at the European Commission. We really couldn't imagine a better group of people to deal with this very complicated issue of the implications of COVID for Africa. And without further ado, I'll ask Ellen Johnson Sirleaf to kick us off. Please, Madam President.
Thank you very much.
We cannot hear you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. It's a great pleasure to join you today. At the start of 2019, Africa was hailed as the rising continent. This dominant view was undisturbed by the Ebola outbreak in West Africa and acts of terrorism in the Sahel. Decades of political and economic transformations moved Africa from the perception of a big man autocracy to improving conditions of participatory democracy, resulting in changes in long-held perceptions. Defined by the democratic dividends of a young and technologically savvy population, Africa was regarded as the young continent of the future. According to the United Nations World Economic Situation and Prospects for 2019, Africa's GDP was projected to increase slightly over the 3.2% of 2018 to 3.4% in 2019 and 3.7% in 2020. 4 of the 10 largest growing growth rates in the world were those of African countries, with 5 countries considered poised for overall transformation. The Mo Ibrahim Index on Governance Register an overall continental score of close to 50 out of a possible 100. Several countries exceeded the continental average, a testament to the growing expansion in the quality of democratic governance across a continent considered despotic in the past. Similarly, several African countries scored higher than the average 50 out of a possible 100 in business regulatory environment and absence of restriction on foreign investment. This provided strong evidence of a move from public to private investment as the catalyst for economic growth. As an indication of democratic and global trends, access to technology in Africa was growing at an astonishing pace. Such connectivity represents a new opportunity for education, health, and access to employment across the continent and the global community. Unarguably, Africa's progress was equally matched by challenges. African youth, 75% of a population of 1.3 billion, faced a bleak future due to the effects of rising population and declining job opportunities. This, in turn, risks undermining the peace and stability that has prevailed in many African countries. Africa 2063, the continent's vision of itself, comprised targets that are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. At the same time, the ratified African Continental Free Trade Agreement and NEPAD provide useful instruments and platforms for implementation of national agendas, policies, and programs. While Africa has continued to depend on and look to international bilateral and multilateral partnerships to foster development, the determined goal is to deepen efforts toward breaking the chains of dependency and fostering the continent's development through sustainable self-efforts and a proper management and protection of national assets. So far, I have spoken of Africa's potential projections while employing past tenses. This is because in 2020, COVID-19 presented the world and Africa with a new reality, one we are yet to fully understand and determine. This pandemic presents multidimensional challenges globally and risks the achievement of Africa's development goals. As healthcare systems falter and collapse under the strains and stresses of COVID-19, understandably, many African countries that have weak health systems and limited resources will be more severely impacted by the virus. The disruption in supply chains are already exacting adverse impact on domestic production. Balance of trades are affected as exports required to fund the inputs for national consumption are being streamlined or shut down. From oil production to manufacturing and retail distribution, previously thriving industries and businesses are withering under the effects of COVID-19. Giant economies are falling into recession as fragile states, especially those still trying to recover from the economic and social fallouts of Ebola, face even deeper challenges and adversities. Economically depressed communities, already overburdened with unemployment and insecurities, are enduring even more job losses and reduction in incomes in desperate to meet response measures. Many of these countries are trying desperately to resist human rights abuses, which they must, as they face the imposed conditions of isolation, contractions, and restrictions on their ability to respond to the daunting challenges of COVID-19. Africa appears to have managed the spread of the virus on account of timely measures, preventive policies, and effective responses, and in some countries, due to experiences gleaned from successfully managing other outbreaks such as Ebola. Africa is still reporting over 1.2 million confirmed infections, which are predicted to increase on account of reopening to normal conditions in many countries. However, for many countries, the economic prospects in the next 2 to 3 years are dire. This is due to the decline in growth, debt sustainability, employment, domestic production, and revenues. The prevailing global complexities, uncertainties, shifts in priorities and leadership only serve to worsen the already difficult situation. effective mitigating policies and determined actions can change the situation and put Africa back on track. Of course, in this regard, the primary responsibility rests with Africans themselves, African leaders, civil society actors, entrepreneurs, and the African people. The absolute priority must be to bring COVID-19 to an end globally through the observance of appropriate response measures and an outreach of needed support. First, leaders need to ensure the economic stimulus is used to meet the humanitarian needs of the most vulnerable in the society. This support must also extend to small and medium-sized businesses that are the engines for growth creation and income generation. Second, partnerships with the private sector must be adopted to ensure changes in policies that are aimed at stimulating growth. This may require structural changes in policies, such as shifting of economic services from state-owned enterprises with evidence of waste to more disciplined and accountable private sector management. Moving services from the public to private sector will spur innovation, entrepreneurship, competition, improvement in service delivery, and increased accountability and transparency, which are needed at a time of scarcity in available resources. The direct involvement of civil society and the people will be crucial. It will help to achieve public buy-ins and support for the successful and sustainable implementation of policies. More importantly, inclusion will guarantee peace and security of countries. All of these prescriptions are necessary and yet insufficient. To succeed, there must be transparency and accountable governance through legitimately democratic and responsible leadership. This quality of leadership committed to policies of inclusion is the key to unlock the door to enduring success. Yet, Africa cannot do it alone. In his letter to the G8 on behalf of African countries, Ghana President Nana Akufo-Addo said, "It is clear that the exigencies of the pandemic require substantial investment in strengthening health systems as well as funding stimulus packages." I cannot agree more. And in this context, I join the call for access to additional concessional financing through easing of restrictions on special drawing rights. This will be critical to reducing Africa's future debt burden and the need for infusion of fresh capital. These measures relate largely to support from the International Monetary Fund. To put it bluntly, more will be required. The World Bank, the European Union, international specialized institutions, and bilateral programs will be needed in a fairer and more equitable manner so that small, poor, and fragile states are not tragically left behind. Africa-owned and resident institutions must be called upon to play major and leading roles in the recovery process. The continent's premier financial institution, the African Development Bank, has been a growth catalyst through its 5 operational priorities. The AFDB must therefore also readjust and realign priorities in the interest of equity for the lower income countries while prioritizing support with specificity in alignments with national agendas. Departing from practices of the past, partnership support for capacity building and participation of Africa in non-governmental research and professional institutions must seek to provide the resources and the opportunities that enable these national and domestic institutions to develop into first-class entities that can deliver competitive services and outstanding results. This will ensure the effective implementation and sustainability of national programs and projects. Simply put, the future of Africa must be driven by Africans. This is why I call for support for the African Center of Disease Control to join world scientists in the development of vaccines. I also call for support for the African Center for Economic Transformation to take the lead in support to African countries in their economic recovery efforts. This too is why I raise my voice in a call for support for national institutions of research and analysis, the think tanks of Africa. A word about social media. Technology has made it possible for events in the public space and sometimes in the private as well to become a fodder for public discourse. No doubt, the many platforms of social media has changed the world, providing important and empowering tools, enhancing freedoms and guaranteeing expressions. We have seen this tool used by civil society and the media to more effectively engage, assess, and referee governance policies, impacts, and even leadership practices. The truth also is that we have seen it abused with problematic effects in the widespread of unsubstantiated claims, including against safeguarding the best interests of the public. In health crisis, for instance, these disseminations can prove costly and dangerous. A healthy balance must be found to avoid misleading the public, especially in a health crisis, so as not to further weaken national effort at recovery and undermine the security of states facing grappling real threats of instability, insecurity, and even terrorism. One last word on Africa. The change in global leadership, policies, and politics may also have lasting political and economic effects on Africa. While these changes realign and offset priorities of multilateralism, freedom, and democracy, they will correspondingly take on redound on Africa. Africa, after all, is a member of the global community. Global values and priorities understandably influence Africa's values and priorities. These values and support have been critical for Africa's performance to date and are critical to defining future successes. Let me now use the opportunity of this event to offer a personal perspective on the effect of coronavirus in Africa and the world. COVID-19 has slipped across the security of boundaries and borders to infect big and small countries alike. It is indiscriminate in its painful and crippling effects on lives and livelihoods. Indeed, Bruegel is Europe-based. May I offer a special thought to my European friends. Last year, at the close of Africa's Friends of Europe meeting in Brussels, I had the privilege of speaking. I would like to remind of some of what I said then, today. The Second World War witnessed a shift in world power and perception. Europe came to be removed from the epicenter as the United States, Russia, and now China and Asian nations have all risen to claim important roles and places in economic and political considerations. The next century will prove more challenging for Europe as world powers, including those that form the core of European alliances, are driving toward nationalism, populism, and isolation, with growing consequential threats to freedom, democracy, and multilateralism. Brexit is but one example. What does all of this mean, and how will it be reflected in a historical and prospective European-Africa friendship and partnership? I cannot pretend to have the answer. Suffice it to say, the Europe of today could not have been what it is without Africa. Europe still relies on Africa for raw materials, minerals, and for cheaper production of goods. Even its advancement in technology relies on Africa's resources. Europe must find new ways to get and remain at the forefront of innovation and technological development. This means it must compete with other areas of the world. Africa offers possible solutions which Europe should welcome and look to explore. For example, as Europe's population ages, it needs the influx of young people to replace the retiring so as to increase the workforce and bring those skills and ideas to the European market. Please note that my friendly admonition with a pronunciation of the help Africa wants from Europe. Rather, I have offered a small example of the help that Africa can give to Europe. There's no doubt that Europe, which currently provides help to Africa through the European Union and bilateral programs, can do more to meet Africa's needs in defending COVID-19. Indeed, Europe can do more towards Africa's economic recovery, which are essential to maintaining all of the gains that Africa has already made. Europe has a strong voice in the G7 and G20. Partnership with African voices can move the needle toward providing the support which has been tabled by President Kufuor-Addo, for instance. It is also true that Europe partnership with Africa at the United Nations can move the world closer to equitable representation in the Security Council and improve possibilities of ending protracted conflicts. This will significantly contribute to successfully maintaining international peace and security amid the growing complexities of and interest in many of these protracted conflicts. The fact is that a new partnership of Africa and Europe has far-reaching potentials and ought to be explored and forged for the betterment of the world and the advancement of mutual interests. As I come to a close, I'm reminded of the words of President Michelle Higgins of Ireland during a webinar address to the Institute of International and European Affairs. He said, "When it comes to the continent of Africa, we have so many misperceptions to undo. And if we are to undo the misperceptions, we must reconceptualize and redo development theory and how we practice international trade and manage the architecture of debt and Europe's perception of dependency." I believe the Prime Minister is right. Europe, and indeed Africa, must not attempt to build a new future of partnership and development on archaic and weakened foundations of misconceptions about ourselves. And should we And should we not deceive ourselves about the generational lasting effects of COVID-19? Ultimately, COVID-19 may best be seen not in the paralyzing effects on the global economy and on Africa, but how the world responds to the call for a new world order that strengthens the pillars of democratic governance, provide opportunities for women and youth, and make trade fairer. It will come to be determined how we govern more justly, equitably, and inclusively. In the end, as the scourge is global, it will come to be defined by how committed we are and how we become to strengthen the bonds of our humanity. May we find the inspiration to respond as we know we should in this difficult time for the world. I end this address with a progressive twist on the same expression from the beginning. Africa is a rising continent of the future. Our natural resources of people, mineral, land, and marine stand Africa out with unmatched advantages. Our continent is young, driven by an increasingly technologically savvy population. Our institutional capacities are being empowered. Our infrastructure, particularly in roads and energy, are in a state of advancement, and our democracy is deepening as the space continues to expand. In short, the potential of Africa, matched by its aspirations, speaks of the hope and the promise of a rising continent. I've been long, but I thank you for the opportunity of your invitation and for the kindness of your attention.
Thank you so much, Madam President. That was very informative and very inspiring. And we at Google appreciate very much your participation here. I know that you have to leave soon. Do you have time for one brief question?
I could not leave with all these other young and old minds wanting to inspire me.
Okay,
so I'm here for a while.
So we have a question from, which is anonymous, the focus on growth, which was evident in your talk. The question is growth without environmental sustainability not the traditional pre-Paris recipe? This is what I heard from the World Bank 20 years ago. This is insufficient. Would you comment on that?
No,
Yeah.
My comment is absolutely growth in itself is not sufficient to achieve sustainable development. Growth are quantities, numbers. They do not talk about the quality of life. However, growth has to be the beginning. It has to be the beginning tool for effective development. But that growth has to be inclusive. That growth has to be used to be able to promote the activities that will lead to improved welfares, that will lead to the jobs and the incomes for people that are on the lower scale of the community. And so we need growth, but we need inclusive growth. We need growth that takes into account the environmental issues, the population issues, all of which will affect growth if we do not adjust to them and respond to them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Madam President, there are other questions which we would like to send you, if that's okay. But given the short time and the fact that we have 4 other speakers, I have to stop it there. I hope you can stay with us as long as possible. And certainly if you feel you want to intervene later, please do so. Let me turn now, Hafez, unmute your unmute your microphone. Let me turn now to the Vice President for Africa of the World Bank, my old friend, actually my young friend of a long time, Hafez Ghana.
Okay, thank you very much, Uri, and thank you for young. But I have to say, it's very difficult to speak after President Johnson Sirleaf. So I am not thanking you for that. I think this was a very, very inspiring speech, Madam President, and it's really a pleasure and an honor for me to follow it. When we look at COVID in Africa today, and we look at the number of cases that are known, which has exceeded already 1.2 million people. And we ask ourselves a question, which is, how many cases are not known because of the problems with testing that we see, and the problem with the data itself. So already we're talking about more than 1.2 million people. Half of those, roughly half of those, are in South Africa. Again, the question in my mind, is it true that half of the COVID cases in Africa are in South Africa, or is it just that South Africa is more advanced and has more testing and better data than most other countries? But those are big numbers, and they have been increasing, and therefore one should not underestimate the risk and the human impact of COVID. And the impact of COVID on health systems, especially in the small, fragile states, where the health systems were already very stretched before COVID. Now, this is the health impact and the human impact, but the economic impact of COVID on Africa is probably even greater. And the impact on livelihoods is huge. Now, there are many different estimates. President Johnson Sirleaf talked about the growth that Africa was seeing up till 2019. And now we are projecting a recession in Africa for the first time in 25 years. We're projecting a decline in GDP of around 5%. And that varies from country to country. This decline in GDP also implies an increase in the number of poor people on the continent. We estimate that because of this recession, we will have an additional 25 million Africans who will be thrown into extreme poverty. And the WFP estimates that the number of people suffering from acute hunger in Africa will double because of the impact of COVID. So why? What are the channels that are leading to decline in GDPs, increasing poverty, increasing hunger? Well, the first channel is the fall in commodity prices. It is overall what's happening on the international side. And many of our countries are very dependent on commodity exports, and those countries are losing huge revenues. For example, the largest country on the continent, Nigeria, its revenue has fallen by 70% because of the fall in oil prices. 70% decline in revenues. Tourism. Many of our countries depend on tourism. You can think of the small island economies like Mauritius, for example, and the impact of the COVID lockdowns on the tourism and on those economies. But even a large economy like South Africa, the tourist industry in South Africa could lose up to 400,000 jobs. That gives you a feel for what is happening. Of course, African countries also put in lockdowns in order to deal with the pandemic. And that led to a decline in domestic activity. For example, I give you a number from Senegal, that a decline in retail and recreation services of 44%, a decline in transport services of 50%. Now, on one area that is really worrisome is food security. because we see that the logistics are being disrupted. Imports of food are being impacted. And the result is that we're seeing increasing food prices in many African cities. At the same time as people are losing jobs, are losing incomes, and that is obviously a recipe for greater hunger and food insecurity. You add to that, especially in East Africa, the locust invasion. I mean, we're all talking about the COVID crisis, but there is another crisis also, which is the locust crisis in East Africa and its impact on agriculture and food security. So this is what is happening. What is the response, and what is being done, and what could be done more? And I would like to focus on three areas quickly. The first area is the immediate response, the health response, and how the need to support the health systems, protect lives basically, including strengthening the health systems, including lockdowns, but maybe we need to be thinking about smart lockdowns, lockdowns or actions that protect lives, but also tries to have a smaller impact on people's livelihoods. And we see many institutions, including the World Bank, where our initial focus has been to help countries in financing their health systems. And we nearly had we have a health project now in nearly every African countries focusing on the COVID area. One of the challenges that you face is not just the financing, but it's actually procuring things like ventilators and so on that were quite scarce on the world market. On the health system, one big worry that we have is that short-term shock, which is COVID, could also lead to have a long-term impact. Because as we are focusing more and more, as countries are focusing more and more on the COVID response, some important health activities like immunizations for children, vaccinations are being ignored, and that could have long-term effect. The second aspect of the response, second point I wanted to mention also quickly, is protecting livelihoods. And what have we learned, and what is happening now? Well, in the OECD countries, there have been packages to protect jobs, to keep companies afloat, and so on. And in most African countries, they've done the same thing. Central banks have reduced interest rates, have made it easier to refinance loans. Governments have given tax holidays to companies and so on. However, 80% or more of African jobs are in the informal sector. And those people cannot be reached through those types of mechanisms. And so what we're seeing across the continent and what is happening is an expansion of safety net programs, cash transfer programs that are aimed at helping informal workers and people who own in informal firms. And that is a big change, because a new lesson for across the continent, because the focus has always been on providing social protection to the poorest of the poor in Africa, and these are usually in rural areas. But the people who have been hit in urban areas now also need support, and these are new aspects. Now, the third point I wanted to mention is moving out of the crisis, and what kinds of investments and what are the lessons for the future. And I would mention three kinds of investments. The first one is the digital economy. What we have learned is the importance of the digital economy. If we did not have the internet, we would not be having this meeting that we have today. The countries in Africa that have strong systems, like Kenya or South Africa, have had a their governments were able to function better. They have had a better, have the smaller impact than countries where they don't have this kind of, where they do, where there's a weakness in the digital economy. The internet penetration rate in Africa now is 40%. We should aim at reaching 100% internet penetration, universal access to the internet. This is a lesson we learned from COVID. It's important for education, it's important for health, it's important for good governance. We did some estimates in the World Bank that actually, if this is achieved, you can increase employment by 7 to 13%. And that is because it's not because you create employment in the high-tech industries, but that's employment across all sectors. So that is the first lesson, and I am aware of the time, but there is different areas that you need to work on to achieve this universal access to the internet, including the investment in the infrastructure, education, developing the platforms on the internet, and improving the regulatory framework. This is the total cost of that initiative, which we have been working on with the African Union, is $80 billion. So if you do it over 10 years, that's $8 billion a year, half private sector, half public sector, roughly. So it is not, it is quite doable. We just need to have the political will to achieve it. Now, the second area, as we look into the future, is the green economy, and especially green energy. Now, and that comes quickly. I mean, if you want to go into a modern digital economy, you need electricity, you need power. And today we have we need to get power to about 800 million more people who do not have enough power in Africa. Achieving that in the past would have been very difficult because the cost of connecting everybody to the grid and using the old technologies is very difficult. But with the new renewable energies, with the solar, with wind, using mini grids, using off-grid technologies, the goal of universal access to electricity in Africa is achievable now. And that is not just done by governments. These are investments that private companies can do, and we're seeing more and more private investments in solar and in other in small hydro, in other renewable energy areas. So when we talk about sustainable development and green technology, it is not just an issue of protecting the environment and the planet. I think it is also an issue of the dividends and the growth and development and job creation on our continent. The third point I wanted to mention that is really important, and I know it's very close to the heart of President Johnson Sirleaf. She and I had a chance to discuss this before, is the importance of investing in women and women empowerment in Africa. That COVID has led to a deterioration in the situation of the African women. And this is serious because in all our analysis, women empowerment is highly correlated to the human capital index. So what is happening because of COVID? Children are not going to school. We have the experience from Ebola before. The children that stopped going to school, many of them, and mostly the girls, don't return when the schools reopen. And so the focus really on girl education is important, and we need to think of ways of making sure that the girls go back to school once the schools reopen. The second thing that's happening, most African women operate in the informal sector, especially in the trade. and they have been mostly impacted by that. And finally, we see an increase in gender-based violence with the lockdowns and so on. So this is the third area that I wanted to underline, really the importance of of making sure that the gains of African women are not eroded by COVID, and that actually we need to do much more in that area. And it's linked to the point that the President certainly raised on demography. The women empowerment is important for the demographic transition. Finally, there is we see a huge need for financing, because we need to have a stimulus. We need to do the social safety nets. We need to protect jobs, and at the same time, governments are losing revenues. We estimate that the cost of the stimulus, the financing gap in Africa today, is around $100 billion. And African countries do not have the same fiscal space that OECD countries have. And there is a need, therefore, to look at how much support we can mobilize for Africa. It's also important to look at the issue of the debt. African countries pay around $40 billion a year in debt service. About a quarter of that is to official bilateral creditors. So what can be done on the debt side, and how can we support Africa more? In conclusion, I would like to echo what President Sirleaf said. Let us not forget that Africa is the continent of the future. It is the continent with the natural resources. It's the continent with the youth. It's the continent with 1.2 billion people that has signed a free trade agreement. It is potentially the largest market, fastest growing market, and therefore I think it is really we need to think of Africa as the continent of opportunity, and then all of new investments would be win-win in that continent. Thank you very much, Ori. Let me stop here.
Hafez, thank you so much for that very specific set of recommendations, and one can only hope that this terrible tragedy of COVID-19 will provide a new impetus for assistance, particularly in the areas of the providing internet services, providing power, etc., without which we could not be operating anywhere in the world today, and certainly not in Africa. So let me turn then next to Trudy Makaya, who is the advisor to the President of South Africa on economic issues. Yes, Trudy, please unmute your microphone.
Thank you, Uri. Thank you for your introduction. It's an honor to share the panel with these esteemed guests that you have composed. And good afternoon to you, Madam President Johnson Sirleaf. It truly is an honor to be sharing this platform with you. I think we are at that moment in our history where we could lose the gains that have been made over a generation by the African continent. So it is very important that we avoid the negative scenario where we might find that there are permanent losses to potential output that are created by the fallout to the pandemic. So a lot of our policy development work in South Africa has been precisely to ensure that what should be a short-term manageable shock doesn't translate into a permanent impact. Of course, it will take time for the recovery to play out, but we have to ensure that we maximize the potential of the economy as much as possible. Now, we can talk about the figures in terms of infections. Yes, South Africa has the big bulk of the numbers. We had a peak around July when we were seeing over 10,000 new cases a day. But now in September, we're down to just over 2,000 cases a day. So we're still in it. We're still going through the epidemic, but there's a clear drop off in numbers. We've also been loosening our restrictions in terms of our lockdown levels. So the caution is also to ensure that we don't have a second wave of infection as other countries have experienced when they start opening up their economy. So we're very cautious of that. At the same time, we want to maximize as much economic activity as we possibly can. Now, in terms of predictions, there have been many predictions that have been made, forecasts on the South African economy by government institutions, and also by the private sector. And the median puts us at about -7 to -8% of a knock in 2020 in annual GDP growth, and a slight uptick in 2021. But we'll only really revert back to 2019 levels estimated in about 2022. So it's going to be a recovery that requires very careful policy development. Just taking a moment to look at the continental view. I mean, I think as Madam President has clearly articulated, as our own President Ramaphosa has also, as chair of the African Union, made repeated calls that, the continent is putting a lot of resources in terms of its own efforts to ensure the health response and also the economic response, but that there are also some fairly modest requests for assistance that have been made to the international community. And, we have seen some of those met, but we would encourage a deepening of that response. So there's the debt suspension initiative backed by the G20, which is underway, and many eligible African countries have stepped forward to take advantage of that. We do see some constraints because there is uncertainty as to how some of this will play out with credit rating agencies. And so we've also been trying to advocate strongly that this is a crisis which is not of anyone's making. And so the way we think about debt metrics, the way we think about debt sustainability, even for credit rating agencies who look at objective measures, they should consider that the only way that countries are going to get through this and sustain the economic development in future is if they don't have fear in terms of tapping into debt relief measures, and they don't have fear of being downgraded or losing their access to capital markets when they are just acting rationally in the face of a crisis. There have been various estimates as to how much the continent needs in terms of stimulus and budget support, anything from 100 billion US to 200 billion US over the medium term. I mean, I think the message there is simply that to ensure that there's growth that helps us to overcome this crisis, we're going to have significant stimulus. It can't be business as usual. And at the same time, we have to acknowledge that African countries, many of them, like South Africa, don't necessarily have the fiscal space to pull it off without significant international support. And of course, we would also echo the points that have been made by Madam President Johnson Sirleaf on the matter of special drawing rights as one other instrument available in the international community to reallocate resources through the IMF special drawing rights to developing countries. Now, turning specifically to South Africa and how we're thinking about the recovery, I mean, I think, for many countries, the themes are common. Infrastructure development is going to be a big driver of recovery. We're looking at network industries like water, electricity, transport, to put money back into those key infrastructures that keep economies going, and to, take care of the maintenance backlog that has built over time, but also develop new ways to connect the country, to connect the poorer and richer parts of the country, the remote and the urban, to move goods across the country to ports. So we're trying very hard to build that infrastructure, and we're doing it in partnership with the private sector. Because once again, we acknowledge that we don't, as government, wouldn't have the financial resources to meet our full infrastructure backlog, but also that private financiers will also bring a lot of know-how and execution capability that will ensure that our infrastructure development is delivered in a far more efficient way and a cost-effective way for the state. We're also looking at infrastructure as a way to ensure that our recovery is jobs rich. So in terms of the kinds of infrastructure projects we're driving, we're hoping for labor intensity and to ensure that we can draw people in who have lost their jobs or whose jobs are at risk through projects that really make a difference. Now, the points have also been made around building our productive base. South Africa is fairly industrialized, but many observers will also know that in previous years, we've been suffering deindustrialization. And so we have to then claw back and ensure that we deepen our productive base and we don't lose our industry, we don't lose our manufacturing, and that we're also going into new areas of development. And so with that, there's a lot of effort towards ensuring that we can meet our requirements. We've, like many countries, had the scramble for ventilators, the scramble for PPE, protective gear. And we believe that some of that should be locally manufactured. And so we will work harder to ensure that in terms of essential medical supplies, we have the production locally. In many other areas, we see that we can strengthen our supply chains and also attract investors who want to diversify their international locations. The experience that we've had now shows us the dangers of having concentrated supply chains. And so South Africa presents an opportunity for that. But we're very mindful that we're also just one country on a very vibrant and diverse continent. And so we want to situate our reindustrialization and our productive efforts within the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, because we think that is that's our market size. That is the market that we should be working on, and that we should be pivoting our trade towards trading more with the continent. Now, a country like South Africa, a country like Nigeria, and a few others would also have to be careful that in dealing with regional integration, we show how we are not just going to be the manufacturing base and everyone else has to buy from us, but that we want to have diverse value chains across the continent, so that we have regional value chains and not excessive concentration in any part of the continent. And I think with our policy of investment-led trade, where we also encourage South African companies to invest in other parts of the continent and produce there too, so that our trade is balanced and we're able to take advantage of the scale that our vibrant continent provides. I'm conscious of time, so I'll just conclude on the issue of green growth. South Africa, in many ways, was at the forefront of the green energy movement in terms of having bids of renewable energy over the past 10 years. We've had a bit of a slowdown in our green energy programs, but with the new integrated resource plan that we've put forward, we're still ambitious in terms of procuring more green energy, more renewable energy. But we also want to preserve an energy mix and an energy transition that makes sense within the context of our country and its development. We're also very keen in terms of our commodities to develop those commodities that are inputs into green development. Vanadium goes into batteries. Hydrogen will go into fuel cells. So we also want to position our commodities for the green economy. But for all that to happen, requires a lot of support in terms of means of implementation for the just transition. We often talk about how, for instance, if you look at cumulative carbon emissions over time, Africa is only 1/10 of the cumulative emissions of a United States. It's only about 1/10 of the emissions of a Europe. And so a lot of rhetoric has been advanced in terms of helping Africa to invest in green growth, understanding that it's not responsible for the majority of emissions. But a lot of that hasn't come to fruition in terms of actual flows of green financing, climate financing. And so we want to advocate quite strongly that as much as we want to participate in green growth and green development, there's got to be a recognition that we have to do it in a way that doesn't impose transition costs, unfair transition costs on our economies. But we do see this as the future. I'll conclude to say also on tourism, of course, we're a very tourism dependent country and continent. But we do think that ecotourism, very aligned with the green agenda, aligned with sustainability, is one area of tourism where there's a clear future and where there could actually be development despite the pandemic. So we remain bullish. We are very clear on the paths that we're going to take in terms of economic recovery, but we continue to urge the international community in terms of all those financing and support mechanisms that will ensure that the market, the African continental market, is sustained, and that this doesn't set back progress, amazing progress that has been achieved over a generation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tude. Indeed, that statistic that Africa accounts for only 1/10 of the cumulative emissions of Europe and the United States is a striking one in the context of the discussions that people are having about burden sharing in reducing carbon emissions. I'm very aware that the time is short, but we will extend the session, by several minutes to make sure that Patricia and Koen have the time that allotted to them. So Patricia, we turn over to you as the CEO of Vodafone, and the only person who actually has to work so hard for a living because you're in the private sector. Please go ahead. Yes.
Thank you, Uri, and thanks for the opportunity to share the private sector perspective on this panel. It's an honor to be meeting President Elif. So when this pandemic started, sometime in March for Vodafone, our first priority was to partner with governments, partner with the citizens to save lives, to deal with the health crisis. So we put together a 6-point plan. And we're really focused on ensuring that people could stay connected, our citizens, our employees, people were working from home. So our first priority was to make sure we had a resilient network. We increased capacity by about 60% because we saw over 50% increase in data traffic in many markets. The next thing was, how were people going to get connected? Our health workers, our government services. And so putting devices in the hands of our health workers, like we did in South Africa, in Kenya, in Lesotho, was basic, but it was very, very important. People couldn't even access the health websites. And so we had to make sure these were accessible. We had in Ghana a telecenter with 50 multilingual doctors just participating on phone, online, just supporting the citizens. Now, our students have been home since March. And in Ghana, the president announced they'll go back to school in January. How are students going to keep themselves abreast with everything that's going on? And so we said that we're going to move educational content online. And so on our Instant School platform across our globe, we pushed educational content for students to have access. And for where the access was already available, the content was available, we said we will zero rate, so that you don't have the basic problem of having to pay for data to be able to stay educated. And this has really, really supported our youth and the economy. We have been also helping government. I think data has been so important in times like this. And so we said we're going to support with aggregated, anonymized, mobility insights, data, AI-driven modeling, contact tracing apps, definitely in line with the privacy legislation in each country, but making sure that we could provide data. In Ghana, for example, we worked with the Ghana Statistical Service, and especially during the lockdown, we're able to understand population movements to help shape the policy and the decisions the government was making on the fly. And so that support has also come in very, very helpful. I cannot talk about Africa without discussing and mentioning the tremendous work that has gone into working with the central banks. Mobile money transactions, driving a cashless payment, driving greater financial inclusion was very paramount within the period. And so we worked with the central banks to adjust all the mobile money transaction fees. In many markets, we actually took the fees off. We also improved the tier limits for people so that they could transact and not have the face-to-face contact. So today, although we started in Safaricom in Kenya, we now have operations in 8 African markets with about 40 million customers, and we transact about $14 billion in transactions every month. So in donations and in money, in services, today across the world, we surpass about 100 million euro of support that Vodafone has put into this pandemic as a way of support. But then, just like Hafiz said, looking at the health crisis as the immediate priority, we are now supporting the economic recovery process that is happening in many of our markets. We are looking at strengthening the social resilience, and by that I mean that collective ability to recover from the challenge and the difficulties of our past, trying to build a better future. I think it's important that we start now. The pandemic is impacting livelihoods, it's impacting trade, it's impacting economic growth. As he mentioned, 25 million people in Sub-Saharan Africa are being pushed into poverty. And so there's a very deliberate effort that private sector has to make in supporting this to happen. So for us, apart from that immediate help to improve infrastructure, we now have to make sure that we make it future-proof, and that's supporting the economic recovery, putting in a network that is future-proof. It should be safe, it should be resilient, and that the quality of the communication should be good, because businesses are going to thrive on communication and digital services going forward. We have to make sure that we are investing in network infrastructure, and we're actively doing this. We are participating in infrastructure sharing, and we're also co-investing in programs, especially in the remote and the rural areas. This is going to be very important. Kids are still studying under trees, and taking investment infrastructure technology into our rural and remote areas is going to be important. We have to support governments to digitize the health service. I think e-health, e-education is going to be basic. We have to leverage on telemedicine. We have to leverage on digital services, apps. If you look at what we've done in Nigeria, in Mozambique, in Tanzania, today you have medication reminders, stock management tools. We have actually improved the coverage and the clinical management for more than almost 100,000 patients, and so getting the health system digitized is a key focus for us going forward in how we support the economy. The third one is the fact that this crisis will create new inequalities. There will be rising youth unemployment. It's happening. There's a growing gulf between the rich and the poor, the young and the old. And so we need to create new opportunities to improve digital skills. Now, I keep saying this to the youth of Ghana, that you need to acquire these digital skills. It's no longer a choice. It's going to be important. And we need to work in partnerships with our governments, with our NGOs to make this happen. And this is something that we are actively doing in for example, in DRC. We're working very closely with businesses. We want to make sure that they have a safe and secure digital solution. If you look at agriculture, for example, I take this as an example. We are working actively with on our Connected Farmer service. It's a service that we offer, for example, in South Africa today. We're trying to digitize the agriculture supply chain so that today about 1.5 million farmers, smallholder farmers, are already on the platform, and ensuring that they can measure, they can record their data. IoT is being used for soil soil moisture probes, we have satellite information to help to drive profitability yields in a much better, in a much secure, and a much safer way, you know, and protecting the environment which is under their control. So providing that digital adoption for business is a key focus for us. And I already talked about data. We will continue to support governments with the anonymized mobile insights to help to make decisions going forward. For Africa, again, I say that we have done the basic on mobile money, on M-Pesa, on mobile financial services, but it's very important that we move into remittances, digital wallets, merchant payments, deepening the use of the mobile financial service digitally, enabling businesses on how they connect, how they are paid, and for very, very basic services. It's going to be very, very critical for Africa. And so if we have to build this resilience, this digital, this green society that we are all talking about, I think that for me, for Vodafone, the call to action is very, very clear. Governments have a critical role to play in leadership. Governments will have to provide, there has to be that closer collaboration with industry, with the NGOs, because we will bring the expertise, we will bring the solutions, we'll bring the targeted investments to make this change that we're all talking about. Today, if you look at, just like Hafi said, Vodafone invests about $1 million every year in network upgrades just across the continent, $1 billion, right? However, if you look at the gap that's created on just providing universal, affordable, good quality broadband access, the gap is about 80 to 100 billion. 80 to 100 billion. And so under this prevailing conditions where private investments are not increasing, Africa budgets, government budgets are tightening, priority is being given to the citizens' most imminent needs, and regrettably, some donors are having to focus on their own domestic reconstruction. It is important that we work together. Otherwise, the Sustainable Development Goal 9, achieving that is going to be difficult. We will need to work together to leverage and drive the digital access that has been set as a target. So we were calling for collaboration. We're calling for partnership between governments. And I think President Sirleaf said that very clearly. Moving from just the public sector and shifting to private sector, we'll need that cooperation, we'll need that partnership, we'll need that engagement with also the non-governmental organizations to work together on these challenges that we have all identified so that we can provide the solutions and deliver the digital economies that we are talking about to build a better future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Yet again, underlining the importance of investments in the digital economy, as Hafez did and others have done on this panel. Let me turn to Koen, who's going to give us the perspective from the European Commission. Please go ahead, sir.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I mean, with such outstanding co-debaters, and especially because, and Hafiz already said it, the absolutely powerful, inspiring, and also very comprehensive keynote addressed by President Johnson Sirleaf. Basically, you've said it all, President, and it makes it easier for us because it allows us just to add maybe a couple of thoughts or reflections to what you have set out. And I would maybe like to make 4 or 5 points. The first one is about the fact that if you look how COVID-19 hits countries across the globe, whether rich, less rich, or poorer, we see a massive mobilization on basically 2 main strands. The first one is the health one. How do we deal with the immediate, urgent humanitarian impact of the health situation? And at the same time, in the medium, long term, how can we build stronger, more resilient health systems that are capable of dealing with such pandemics? And secondly, of course, the the enormous social economic impact of COVID-19. And there again, how can we deal with the immediate short-term impact, but also how can we design a recovery that sets our economies on the right track for the future. All of that to do so, all of that requires a number of policy choices, which obviously will very much depend from the situation in which countries or regions find themselves. But what in any case it requires is funding. And we see how across the globe, massive amounts of money are being injected in the system. Massive stimulus packages are being done, financed and supported by central banks, by borrowing on the market. I mean, the European Union itself, just in July, managed to grasp at the level of our heads of state and government what is traditionally every 7 years one of the most difficult negotiations we have on our multi-annual financial framework, our 7-year budget. And that includes, for the first time, a possibility for the EU to go and lend money from the private capital markets to the order of 750 billion. So we see central banks intervening, we see governments doing deficit spending, and we see borrowing on the markets. Obviously, there's a whole group of countries across the globe that have much less potential to do so. And I think very much, as many of you have said, that is where, as a global community, we need to look at COVID-19 for what it is, which is a global crisis that affects us all, and therefore one that requires a global mobilization, where not just everyone tries to save him or herself, but where collectively we rise to the occasion. I think that from a European point of view, that's also why we have tried to lean in heavily within the G20 Paris Club discussions on the debt service suspension initiative, and why we are very keen on keeping to follow up what is now being further discussed on debt service suspension, why we have been working very closely with the IMF and with the World Bank, including through the different European executive directors in the boards, on trying to see how the IMF and the World Bank can mobilize their, let's say, their shooting capacity in as counter-cyclical a way as possible. And that's also why on the EU side, we try as a bilateral donor to respond as quickly and as flexibly as possible to come to support of our partner countries. And I think we've done so. It's a certain source of pride, I think, on our side, that we've been able very quickly, the EU and our member states, to mobilize and partially reorient an amount of 36 billion euros to support partner countries across the globe in dealing with the immediate impact of it. Now, it's not just, I think, about the quantity and the size of funding that we make available. We are very much attached, and many of you have referred to it also, to the qualitative side of it, meaning that since much of what we're doing now ultimately will have a long-term impact, since much of what we're doing now is basically financed with money that we are borrowing from future generations, it's absolutely essential that the way in which we invest it is done in a way that is future-proof. And this is the agenda that we've been trying to set out, very much in line also with what the UN Secretary General Guterres has pitched as this Build Back Better narrative. Our President von der Leyen has when she attended end of April the Financing for Development UN conference, presented the political idea for a global recovery that is very much in line with those principles. And that's also why in our engagement with partners across the globe, be it in Latin America and the Caribbean, be it in Asia, the Pacific, and obviously with Africa, we very much like to discuss how we can make what we do together really future-proof. And that means indeed make it green in the very comprehensive way of seeing it. It is about climate change. It is about renewable energy. It is about sustainable agriculture. It is about modern multimodal transport. It is about urban development. And so how can we bring that agenda into the way in which we design policies, programs, projects for the future? It is obviously digital, and digital in a certain way. Digital in a way that doesn't only look at do we present the necessary network coverage, but also do we build in the educational aspects and the skills? Do we build in the necessary economic angle and entrepreneurship? Do we build in the governance system that allows consumers and users to be sure? And you know that on that point of view, Europe is extremely ambitious when it comes to protection of privacy and so on. So there's a whole governance model that comes within our view a future-proof digital development that is very much important. Liked very much the reference that Trudy made as well to environment, biodiversity, and ecotourism. I mean, if you look at Africa, if you look at the appetite of consumers worldwide, and if you look at a huge potential in Africa for ecotourism linked to biodiversity and environmental protection, I mean, it's really massive, and I think it's something that should definitely draw our attention. By the way, I also think that's something which we are now exploring. There's lots of, let's say, global financing that with a long-term trend to push green finance, the pension funds, the investment funds globally are looking for returns on investment that are green. We can see how, notably in Africa, the potential for those investments is huge. There are reasons why, for the time being, I think there is still an intermediation problem between where the big money sits and where the big potential is, linked to investment climate, structure of the financial markets, and so on. But we really think that there is scope to work together to start narrowing that gap so that much more of that funding can be drawn through asset managers, can be drawn to that enormous potential that exists on the African continent to basically accept to be a source or a destination for those kind of green investments. That brings me maybe to my final point, which I would very much dovetail with what President Johnson Sirleaf has said, and that is about the need in that perspective for a real reset, a rethink of the way in which relations between Europe and Africa function. And I think that in the past, already at the Abidjan summit and what followed, we've made first steps in that direction. But I think that with an acceleration of history that COVID-19 is no doubt generating, more is needed, much more fundamental. And I think that there is an awareness also on the European side, definitely at the level of our top leaders, that there is a need to do so and that there is a window of opportunity to do so. I think it requires a reset of the politics. We've been talking for long about a partnership of equals, one that doesn't look at those two continents as one of a donor and a recipient, but one where deepening that relation is really a win-win. And I think that that's the kind of political switch we now, as we prepare the next Europe-Africa summit, it's a political switch which we really need to make. Secondly, it needs to be translated and embedded also in our policy engagement. One of the things I've liked a lot about what we've been doing over the last years since Abidjan were these task forces which we created, where we, on a number of major topics, energy, agriculture, transport, we've created groups on a parity basis with Africans and Europeans, representatives top level from private sector, from CEOs, so CEOs from private sector, academics and think tanks, politicians that have worked together during a number of months, 1 year, 1.5 years, on digital, by the way, as well, to come up with recommendations. And what was nice on this approach was that it was not just on a par as a matter of principle, but was driven by the very clear understanding that in all those areas, there is as much that Europeans can learn from Africans as what Africans can learn from Europeans. And it is something that we very much want to keep building on. It's basically what I think is a very modern management principle. It's the principle of co-creation. By the way, you will have noticed that the title of my commissioner used to be the Commissioner for Development and International Cooperation, that under the current commission, the president has decided to change that name, and my commissioner is now the Commissioner for International Partnerships, full stop. And I think it translates as well the awareness that what we're looking for is really a different approach. I fully agree as well with what you've said, President, that this also means that working with key African partners like the ACET, the African Center for Economic Transformation, like the ACDC, I would add the work we would like to do and to boost with national development banks. And here we are working very closely with France in view of the Paris Peace Forum on the first global summit of national development banks. So plugging much more into the wealth and the capacity that exists in Africa itself as partners to work with. I think this is a must in order to design that new partnership. And it brings me to my very last point, that obviously affects as well the way in which we deploy the funding that we have at our disposal to support those international partnerships. And we will no doubt see an even further increase and acceleration of the trend we've embarked upon over the last years already, which is an increasing importance of budget support as an implementation modality, because we feel that through budget support, we basically plug our support directly into the budgets of national authorities, national governments, or also subnational local authorities. It has very little transaction cost, but it has especially the advantage that it really supports in a very direct way African solutions. Similarly, the way in which we deploy our guarantees through development finance institutions, including obviously national development banks and the African Development Bank, again, moving away from the traditional project implementation approach and mainly using our money to leverage and support financing from others. And of course, a very strong technical assistance and capacity building component, where there again, very much, as you've said, supporting really African partners, African institutions, because the design and the implementation of the policies in Africa are best done by and with our African partners themselves. Final word, youth and women. They will be, I think, the focus of everything we will do, not just because they are the ones that are maybe most fragile, maybe most likely to be hit first, but also because they have shown in the past to be the ones that are absolutely a driver for creativity, for change, and for resilience. So making sure that we put young people, girls and women at the center of everything we do together with you will be absolutely essential. I will stop there because I see that the time is running out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Koen. That was wonderful. I could not emphasize more the importance of a partnership mentality in the development process. What could be more important? I'd like to close this. Unfortunately, we don't have time to take several questions that we have here on the chat. To thank again everybody, and particularly President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, for being with us and staying with us the whole session. We're especially proud at Google that we were able to host in this important session 3 brilliant African women. Thank you very much, and all the best to you. All the best.
Thanks to all of you. It was an honor to be a part of all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.